Screeching metal and the low rumble of earth being disturbed shattered the quiet of early morning in Westfield Estates. I had just stepped outside to start my day when I noticed something absurd. My driveway, usually a clear path to my barn and farmhouse, was completely blocked by a barricade of stacked landscaping rocks and an unyielding chain-link fence. There, at the head of the blockage, stood HOA Karen, clad in a crisp navy blazer, her clipboard clutched tightly, her eyes glinting with self-satisfied authority. With an air of absolute certainty, she pointed accusingly at my property, as if my very existence was an affront to the neighborhood's immaculate standards. I couldn't believe my eyes. For months, Karen had made it her mission to police every inch of Westfield Estates, scrutinizing every deviation from the strict guidelines enforced by our homeowners association. But today, she had taken it to a new level by literally barring my driveway. I watched in disbelief as she barked orders to passersby, instructing them that my vehicle must be kept off the road and that I had violated some obscure zoning regulation. In that charged moment, a spark of defiant inspiration ignited within me. I had always believed in the power of innovation, and I wasn't about to let petty rule enforcement ruin my day. Instead of waiting for the board to mediate another pointless dispute, I resolved to take matters into my own hands. I would transform this blockade into a bold statement of my right to free use of my property. And so, I decided that if Karen could block my driveway with a static barrier, I'd counter it with something equally dramatic. I'd dig a giant trench along the perimeter of my property and install a working drawbridge over it. Not only would it restore access to my driveway, but it would serve as a cheeky reminder that ingenuity and persistence always prevail. And as it turned out, it was perfectly legal. The idea was wild, even to me. I envisioned a sunken moat running along the edge of my driveway, a deep trench filled with water that I'd later repurpose with a sturdy, manually operated drawbridge. I imagined Karen's shock when she returned to her meticulously manicured lawn to find that her precious order had been upended by my creative solution. It wasn't just about reclaiming my access. It was about flipping the script on a neighbor who had overstepped her boundaries time and again. With the adrenaline of a challenge coursing through my veins, I set my plan in motion before the morning was through. Today, Karen's petty blockade was about to be met with a technological and theatrical counterstrike that would leave her and the entire HOA rethinking what it meant to enforce community standards. Westfield Estates was the kind of neighborhood that prided itself on uniform perfection. Every home was painted in pastel hues. Every lawn was trimmed to an exact length, and every inch of property was governed by a strict set of rules hammered out by the local homeowners association. The board enforced these rules with unwavering rigor, and any deviation, even a minor one, could result in hefty fines or public admonishment. At the heart of this regimented world stood Karen Miller, known around the community as HOA Karen. In her early 50s and always impeccably dressed in smart, conservative attire, Karen had earned her reputation as the enforcer of Westfield Estate's pristine standards. With a clipboard in hand and a steely glare, she roamed the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, scrutinizing every hedge, every mailbox, every driveway. For Karen, perfection wasn't just an ideal, it was a duty, and she was determined to keep everyone in line. Opposite the rigid order of Westfield Estates, my farm, Sunny Acres, stretched across a generous parcel of land on the outskirts of the community. In stark contrast to the manicured lawns and identical facades of the neighborhood, my property was a working farm, a place where creativity and practicality blended seamlessly. I had inherited Sunny Acres from my family and had invested years in modernizing it. Solar panels glittered on the barn roof, and advanced irrigation systems crisscrossed the fields. My driveway, a long, gravel path leading from the road to my farmhouse and outbuildings, was not only essential for daily operations, but a symbol of my independence. I never intended to ruffle feathers. I believed in working hard, in using technology to improve productivity, and in living life on my own terms. But when Karen began imposing her strict rules on every aspect of Westfield Estates, Even my humble farm wasn't immune. Over the months, I had grown accustomed to her reports about unauthorized modifications and non-compliant property enhancements. I'd taken it in stride until she decided to block my driveway. It was the last straw. My property was a testament to freedom and innovation, and I was determined to defend my right to use it without interference. I had already endured fines for minor infractions, parking too close to a hedge, leaving a door slightly ajar. But nothing could have prepared me for the audacity of someone physically barring my access. Karen's actions weren't just an inconvenience. They were a violation of my property rights and a blatant display of power over someone who had always strived to be self-reliant. In this small corner of the country, where neighbors prided themselves on order and conformity, my approach to life had always been about pushing boundaries and embracing individuality. My farm, with its mix of tradition and modernity, was my pride and joy, a place where I could innovate freely. And when Karen's blockade forced me to consider drastic measures, I knew that I wasn't just fighting for access. I was fighting for the very principle that a homeowner's rights should never be trampled by an overzealous enforcer of rules. The stage was set. Westfield Estates was a battleground between the oppressive conformity championed by the HOA and the spirit of independent ingenuity that defined my life at Sunny Acres. And as I looked out over my land, I felt a surge of determination. I was ready to transform this challenge into an opportunity, a chance to reclaim my driveway, and send a resounding message that real freedom cannot be boxed in by petty rules. The conflict began on a cloudy morning when I returned to my property and found my driveway completely blocked by a haphazard barrier of concrete slabs, metal fencing, and landscaping rocks. There was no warning, no note left behind, just a clear message from Karen: "You are not allowed here." I quickly realized that this wasn't a random act of vandalism, but a deliberate maneuver orchestrated by the HOA enforcer herself. I immediately consulted my security footage from a night before. The images were unmistakable. In the dim glow of streetlights, I saw a figure wearing a hooded jacket, Karen, slipping onto my property. With calculated precision, she began moving large slabs and pieces of fencing, assembling a blockade right in front of my gravel driveway. Every move was methodical, almost as if she'd rehearsed the act. The footage provided irrefutable evidence of her intrusion and her intent to restrict my access. Furious and feeling a deep sense of violation, I documented every detail. I printed out screenshots, noted the timestamps, and began drafting a formal complaint to the HOA board. I outlined how Karen's actions weren't just a minor infraction, but a direct attack on my property rights and my ability to conduct my daily operations on my farm. Yet, knowing the board's history of blindly supporting Karen's stringent interpretation of the rules, I suspected that a formal complaint might fall on deaf ears. Determined to send a message that I wouldn't be intimidated, I began planning my retaliation. I had always prided myself on my ingenuity, using modern technology to enhance my farm's productivity and efficiency. Now, faced with an outrageous blockade, I decided to channel that creativity into a bold counteraction. I would dig a giant trench along the perimeter of my driveway and install a working drawbridge. This wasn't a rash act. It was a calculated, legal move. After all, I owned the property, and nothing could legally prevent me from modifying my own land. I spent the next few days researching local zoning laws and property rights. To my relief and satisfaction, I discovered that as a landowner, I had the absolute right to alter my property in any manner that did not violate state or federal laws. The idea of building a drawbridge, a nostalgic nod to medieval fortresses, was as outrageous as it was brilliant. Not only would it provide me with unobstructed access to my property, but it would also serve as a tongue-in-cheek rebuke to Karen's attempts to impose her will. I mobilized my trusted crew and began the work at first light. With excavators and heavy machinery, we dug a wide, deep trench running along the block section of my driveway. The sound of shovels and engines filled the air as the trench took shape, a visible, irreversible assertion of my rights. Once the trench was completed, I installed a custom-built drawbridge that could be raised or lowered at will. The structure was robust and, most importantly, legal. I even had a local contractor certify that the modifications were within all local codes, a final nail in the coffin of any potential legal pushback. As I worked, I could almost picture Karen's reaction. I imagined her pacing in disbelief, clipboard trembling in her hands, as she saw my driveway transformed into a veritable fortress complete with a drawbridge. The act wasn't just about reclaiming my access. It was about reclaiming my dignity and proving once and for all that I wouldn't be bullied by someone who thought she could dictate how I use my property. I documented every phase of the project on video and took detailed photos, knowing that if the HOA board attempted to dismiss my actions as vandalism, I would have undeniable proof that everything was done within my legal rights. My online community of fellow homeowners and local activists quickly rallied behind my cause, sharing my updates with supportive comments and hashtags like #DrawbridgeDefense and #PropertyRights. By the time the drawbridge was fully operational, the blockade had been replaced by a dramatic, imposing entrance that symbolized my refusal to bow to petty tyranny. I knew that Karen's next encounter with my property would be unforgettable, and that the incident would become a rallying point for everyone who believed in the sanctity of private property and the freedom to innovate without interference. As word of my bold move spread throughout Westfield Estates, the digital uproar was immediate. Social media exploded with posts and video clips of my newly installed drawbridge and the massive trench that now guarded my driveway. Hashtags like #DrawbridgeDefense, #PropertyReclaimed, and #NoMoreHOA quickly trended locally. Neighbors who had long suffered under the oppressive enforcement of arbitrary rules finally found their voices, and a wave of support swept through the community. Local news outlets were among the first to pick up the story. Reporters drove by my property, capturing every angle of the dramatic transformation. "It's like something out of a movie," one anchor remarked on live television, where a determined homeowner turns a petty neighborhood dispute into a high-tech fortress of freedom. Interviews with residents revealed a growing frustration with the HOA's unchecked authority. Many recalled previous instances of fines and intrusive inspections, and several expressed admiration for the audacity and ingenuity of my response. The HOA board, caught off guard by the escalating controversy, convened emergency meetings. Behind closed doors, board members argued vehemently over how to respond to my actions. Some insisted that the rules must be upheld at all costs, no matter how absurd, while others began to question whether Karen's long history of overreach had reached a breaking point. Leaked minutes from these meetings showed a deep divide among the board. Some members acknowledged that my drawbridge was a legal modification, while others clung stubbornly to the outdated notion that all property must conform to a rigid standard of aesthetic perfection. In online community forums and neighborhood groups, my story was shared widely. Digital petitions demanding that the HOA board reform its policies and hold Karen Baxter accountable gathered thousands of signatures. Videos of the drawbridge in action were remixed with humorous commentary, and residents posted memes that compared my bold move to legendary acts of civil disobedience. "If one person can take a stand, so can we all," one popular post read. The outpouring of support wasn't just for me. It was for every homeowner who had ever felt trampled by arbitrary rules. Karen Baxter, of course, was not silent. In a series of increasingly frantic social media posts, she decried what she called illegal modifications and vandalism on my property. Her tone grew more desperate as she attempted to rally the board's support and discredit my actions. But every time she tried to spin the narrative, the digital evidence, detailed footage of the trench being dug, photos of the drawbridge's construction, and expert opinions confirming the legality of my modifications, overwhelmed her claims. The tension reached its peak when the HOA board announced that a final public hearing would be held to address the incident and determine whether any disciplinary action would be taken against me. The announcement sent shockwaves through Westfield Estates, and on the day of the hearing, the community center was packed with residents, many of whom had come prepared with signs and digital evidence of their own. The atmosphere was electric charged with the promise of change and the collective demand for accountability. In the days leading up to the hearing, local influencers and community activists held small rallies, urging residents to stand up for their rights. Neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak out now shared their own grievances against the HOA's oppressive practices. Every shared video clip, every hashtag, every comment reinforced the message that property rights were sacred and that no one should be bullied into submission by a self-appointed enforcer like Karen Baxter. As the final hearing approached, I continued to document every development, updating my online community with live streams and detailed posts. My digital dossier, comprising security footage, expert testimonies, and energy consumption logs that demonstrated the harmless nature of my modifications, became a beacon for those fighting for freedom in Westfield Estates. The collective voice of the community, amplified by social media and local news, was growing louder each day. The stage was now set for a dramatic confrontation that would force the HOA board to either uphold their outdated policies or embrace a new era of rational, respectful governance. The digital evidence was irrefutable, the public support overwhelming, and the message clear. My property, and by extension the rights of every homeowner, would not be compromised by petty, arbitrary rule enforcement. The tension was palpable, and as the day of the final hearing drew near, it was clear that a watershed moment was imminent, a turning point that would forever redefine the balance of power in Westfield Estates. The decisive moment came on a cool, crisp morning in a packed boardroom at the Westfield Estates Community Center. The room was filled with HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and a diverse array of residents, all gathered to witness the final public vote that would decide the fate of our neighborhood's enforcement policies. With a calm yet unyielding presence, Councilwoman Angela Rivera stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the hope and determination of a community that had grown tired of arbitrary rule enforcement. After an exhaustive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed construction logs, and the impassioned testimonies of our residents, we have reached an incontrovertible conclusion. Councilwoman Rivera began, her voice ringing with authority. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Baxter, specifically the deliberate blocking of a private driveway, which led to the necessity of resorting to legal modifications on private property, were not only baseless but driven by personal bias and a gross abuse of power. Our community's rights as homeowners must be upheld, and the freedom to innovate on one's own property is not a privilege to be arbitrarily curtailed. A heavy silence fell over the room as Rivera continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind any sanctions related to this incident and will initiate a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such overreach. Furthermore, we will implement new guidelines that guarantee the protection of every resident's property rights. Today's decision is not simply about one individual's actions. It is a resounding declaration that Westfield Estates will no longer tolerate the imposition of personal vendettas under the guise of community standards. Her words resonated deeply, and murmurs of agreement rippled throughout the assembly. At that moment, a respected community advocate, known for his relentless defense of private property rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united," he declared, his voice strong and impassioned. "No resident should ever have their ability to live, work, and innovate on their own property undermined by petty, arbitrary rule enforcement. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that our community values truth, innovation, and individual freedom above all. We demand accountability, and we will ensure that every violation of our rights is met with swift, decisive action." His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting the room in a powerful call for reform. Following his address, a senior officer from the local fire department presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, including detailed logs of my property modifications, expert evaluations confirming that my drawbridge and trench were fully legal, and security footage of Karen Baxter's repeated intrusions. The evidence was irrefutable, and the Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures for any abuse of power. The full report was scheduled for immediate public release to ensure total transparency. Councilwoman Rivera concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Westfield Estates, a community where every homeowner's rights are sacred and where public authority is exercised with fairness and integrity. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that we will not allow personal bias to dictate the lives of our residents. Together, we stand for justice, accountability, and the right to innovate without fear of arbitrary interference." Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our battle for property rights. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and a unified voice of the community had forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Westfield Estates. The days of petty, arbitrary rule enforcement were over, and a future built on respect for individual property rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the historic vote, Westfield Estates underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded sanctions and the sweeping reforms enacted by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and social networks, sparking fervent discussions about property rights, accountability, and the importance of protecting individual freedoms. Editorials in the local paper, bearing headlines such as "A New Dawn for Westfield Estates" and "Community United for Innovation and Freedom," celebrated the decisive actions taken to uphold the rights of homeowners. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreBullying, and #InnovateFreely trended widely, reinforcing the community's determination to stand against arbitrary rule enforcement. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their experiences and to envision a future where individual creativity was celebrated rather than suppressed. Neighbors, once intimidated by the strict oversight of the HOA, now spoke openly about their right to manage their own property in a manner that reflected their personal values and aspirations. "Our homes, our farms, and our driveways are our sanctuaries," one resident declared passionately at a bustling meeting, his voice echoing through the crowded room. The atmosphere was charged with hope, a promise that Westfield Estates would forever be a place where personal freedom and innovation were honored. Within the reformed HOA board and local public safety departments, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs emphasizing ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established, ensuring that every complaint would be scrutinized thoroughly and that no homeowner would ever again suffer from arbitrary fines or intrusive enforcement. Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of our community, Lieutenant Reed affirmed in a follow-up press conference, his words resonating with the collective spirit of reform. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations mobilized to empower residents further. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about property rights and to encourage a culture of mutual respect and accountability. When we unite, our voices are powerful enough to dismantle even the most outdated systems, a local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring residents to stand together and demand fairness. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to retaliate against HOA Karen Baxter's audacious theft of my farm's electricity and to issue a symbolic $10,000 fake fine had not only reclaimed what was rightfully mine, but had also ignited a broader movement for property rights throughout Westfield Estates. Neighbors, who had long endured the oppressive enforcement of arbitrary rules, found their voices and shared their own stories of injustice, uniting in a common cause. The digital evidence that exposed Karen's misdeeds became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and the right to live freely. Karen Baxter, once the unchallenged enforcer of the HOA's draconian policies, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when a community stands united. Her influence waned rapidly as digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the need for a more rational, respectful approach to community governance. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Westfield Estates, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the fading glow of a setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights" was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches resonated with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate the victory of our rights over arbitrary interference. A victory for every homeowner in our community, Councilwoman Rivera proclaimed, her voice filled with unwavering determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protecting our freedoms and ensuring that no one can abuse public power again. As each new day dawned over Westfield Estates, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Karen Baxter's petty blockade of my driveway was met with a bold, ingenious response. Dredging a giant trench and installing a drawbridge that reasserted my property rights became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the power of innovation and the sanctity of private property. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Westfield Estates, truth, justice, and personal freedom would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Westfield Estates would forever be a place where freedom, ingenuity, and respect for individual property were cherished above all else.